Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to Behind the App, where each month we'll be taking a look at some of the coolest and most technical Salesforce Labs solutions. I'm Stefan Chandler Garcia, a developer evangelist here at Salesforce, and I'm going to be introducing you to the creators and developers behind some of these really cool Salesforce Labs apps. Now, before we get started with today's session, I just have to point out to tweet hashtag behind the app for any questions that you have around today's session, any feedback, or really just to get close to some of the developers of these apps. Now, I do always have to point out just a little bit about Salesforce Labs. Salesforce Labs is a really cool program here at Salesforce that encourages employees to build apps for the App Exchange. We can take whatever ideas we want where we see maybe a product fit or something that could really help out the community, we can take the opportunity to build these apps and put them through security review and onto the App Exchange. Now, it doesn't stop there. The developers are also encouraged to release their code onto GitHub. And so, for example, if I build an app for the App Exchange, like a lot of the ones that we've been looking at in this program, we can take that code and put it up onto GitHub for everyone to see, take inspiration from, and maybe create their own versions of these apps, just in case it may not fit your needs or your users' needs. And it's just a really helpful way of really giving back to the community and to have Salesforce employees put their skills to the test and create some of these apps. Now, if it's your first time watching Behind the App, there are a couple of segments that we go through the program. And the first one of those is to go through and meet a Salesforce Labs builder, one of those Salesforce employees that's taken the time to build one of these apps and put it onto the App Exchange. We're then going to go through a demo of the app so that we can see an overview and more of a technical walkthrough of the solution and see how it then fits into the context of Salesforce Labs and Salesforce. And then lastly, we're going to solve for X, where we take a look at 3 technical challenges faced by the developers of the apps that really focus on the user interface development, or about building Lightning Web Components. We're going to then talk about the data challenges and ensuring that the components or the apps have the right data within them. And then lastly, we're going to talk about composition and how the app really works with itself and within the Salesforce environment and someone's Salesforce org to function and to really run, and look at that composition there. And so we might as well get to meet today's builders. Now, I actually don't have a guest on the program today because we're going to be talking about one of the apps that I've built for the App Exchange. Yes, I've built many solutions now for Salesforce Labs, and I have one that just gets a lot of interest that I thought would be really useful to take a deep dive into. Now, I did not build this app alone. I did build it with the help of Andrew Patterson, who was my first guest when we talked about the multi-org security summary app. If you haven't checked out that episode, please go back. They're all available on Trailhead Live and on YouTube to see that app and see some of the technical work that went into that solution. But I'm going to be tackling this one alone today and really going into some of the detail around how this app works. And so one of the reasons that I really love contributing to Salesforce Labs is that before I joined Salesforce, I really took advantage of a lot of the solutions that were created and really a lot of inspiration into how some of these problems were solved. And so the second I joined Salesforce, I wanted to hurry and go and build some apps for Salesforce Labs. And I have had the opportunity to do that now. And on top of that, I'm able to even give back by putting things on like this program, creating technical content for Labs developers, and really getting that message out there around the program and the impact that it has on the community. And so today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite apps and one of that I get the most questions about, and that is my community cookie consent application. And what this app does is it really gives your users and your customers, your guest visitors to a community, the ability to manage their cookies when they first join that community. Spending a lot of time in the UK over the last 8 years, I lived there before moving back to the US, it's become a default to give users access and control over their cookies. And so whenever you visit a website, you should be prompted with a banner that allows you to either accept cookies, reject cookies, modify your preferences, and really make changes to the cookies that are being presented and used against your personal data within Salesforce. And I saw cookie consent as a great use case for Lightning Web Components on a community, and a great way to sort of give back, take my knowledge of cookies and privacy in general, and put something on the App Exchange that everyone could take advantage of and use. And that's where we get this app. Now, the big inspiration behind this application is, number one, I've seen so many customer questions about the ability to manage cookies on a community, how to present a cookie banner to someone, and how to really manage that using Lightning Web Components within that runtime. Secondly, if you know me even a little, you know that I love data protection and privacy. And so any opportunity that I have to build an app centered around those topics, I will jump at it and quickly go in and try and find the right solution. And then lastly, I was looking for a challenge. I was looking for some way that I can push my development skills when it came to communities, when it came to Lightning Web Components. And building this component just really looked like a good opportunity to sort of push those skills and see how far we can get in finding a solution for this problem. Now, the core object model of the app consists of really 4 objects, mostly custom objects with one standard object. And that standard object is the individual object. If you've not seen the individual object yet, it's a standard object in Salesforce that relates to all of your people data. So things like your contacts, your leads, your users, your person accounts, your employees. That individual serves as a hub for all of those people and allows you to relate all of those people down to a single object that acts as an identity for that person. Now, that individual object record is used to store that unique bit of information about someone so that we can tell whether or not they've agreed to cookies within their org or whether or not we need to present them with that banner. We then have on the opposite side a custom object for managing cookies, and it allows us to just create a record for a cookie that we can then use to display to the user. We then have our cookie category that allows us to group the cookies so that we can present the user with a group of cookies with a high-level section that they can consent against. And then lastly, we bring that all together with our cookie consent record that we can store against the individual to note what that person's preferences are and whether or not they've agreed to cookies within Salesforce. And those four objects really drive the application. Initially, we were using some of the other consent objects like authorization form consent, but when it comes to permissions and actual guest user access, it became much easier to take the approach of using the custom objects instead of using the standard objects in the org. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the application. We'll do a little demo and technical walkthrough so you can get a better idea of how the application runs and how it was built. So, starting off in the org here, we have our records for our cookies here. You can see if we go into a cookie record, we're just storing information like that cookie name, the description, and then a category for that cookie. There's not much associated to this. It's just a record that we will then use to drive the interface later on when actually viewing the cookies. The real meat of it occurs within the cookie category. And so that cookie consent category allows us to group the cookies. In this case, we have a grouping for functional cookies, and then we can provide a description that's then showed to the user so that they understand what functional cookies are. Keep in mind, we're looking at ways that people can consent to using cookies. If you've done any thought and look into the way that cookies function, you'll notice that a lot of the best practices and patterns involve having this category of consent. If you're in Europe, if you're in the UK, you will see when you have a cookie banner presented to you, they're usually grouped into categories like functional, marketing cookies maybe, and there's different types of categories. And in this case, we just have our name, our description, and then our cookies that exist in that category. You'll see here there's some additional information here. For example, like whether or not that section is mandatory. So if this is marked true, that means the user does not have an option but to consent to this. And then we also have a default value. And that default value allows us to set that default value that is presented to the user when they're accessing cookies. So now, how does this all render within the community? Well, first off, if we go and take a look at what that community looks like here, I've created an example here for managing a solo run club. And this run club gives many options when it comes to cookies. We can see here we have our Lightning Web Component banner here that pulls in that label or that name of that record from that category. It pulls in the description. And you can see here when the page renders, there's a default value. This one has advertising cookies set to accepted, but I can go ahead and decline that if I like. I can expand and hide the sections with the cookie details. Here you can see I can view the name and that description of those cookies as they were set up within Salesforce. And then I can modify that section. In this case, I'll go ahead and accept the functional cookies. And here, in the required cookies, you can see here that I don't have the option to modify this because it's been set as mandatory within that category record. And so that way, the user is forced to accept that. Now, all I can have to do is confirm my cookies, and that record would then be created in Salesforce. Now, what I really like about this app is it has multiple form factors. So in this instance, we're seeing the cookies in this nice little pop-up here on our screen so that when we first navigate to the page, we see cookies there. Now, there's also a more minimalistic view around storing cookies in the footer. And here, if we look at this community, we can see here there's a little banner here in the footer that sticks to the page that allows you to accept cookies, or go in and view the privacy policy and view cookies. Now, the big difference between these two components is that while this one allows you to consent to different sections, the footer view does not. It forces that default preference on the user and allows them to accept cookies. Now, but that is by default out of the package how the app runs. But like I said, you can take that source code and modify it to create different options and experiences for your users. Now, in this instance, though, I can go ahead and view cookies and go in and view all the cookies within the org. And it will take me to a page on the community that is part of the same component that will go and query that cookie data in a similar view to the pop-up, but not let you modify each section. And there you see it brings over, once again, those section names, the descriptions, and then that list of cookies that exists within that section. And now, when we talk about that setup experience, we can go ahead and take a look inside the experience builder to see how that runs. You can see here that there are a number of sections within this. We have our display type, and that can be in the footer, it can be in a modal or in a page, and that will then determine which way it is displayed on that community. If I were to go ahead and change this to a modal here, we can see here, if I go ahead and take that, it then changes that component to render in a different way. And then we can modify that. Once again, if I change that to the footer here, we can see. Now, we can then modify the instructions, the different button labels, and have a really good way of letting users modify those values so that we're not stuck to having to hard code those in code. Our users can just go in to the community builder and modify these based on their company policy. Same thing for this view cookies link. We can modify that so that our users can have a link to a page where they can go out and modify and view those cookies. And then lastly, you can see we have some utilities around positioning, the level of padding that we want to see within that component, just so that you can have really good control over the way that it's displayed for your users without having to modify the source code. And once you make those changes, you can publish them and they're available right in the community. It's pretty straightforward and simple, and that's it. And so when our user consents to cookies, we can see here that we can go into those cookie consent records and we can see that a record was created for that person. And so we can see by section who, as a unique person, modified those cookies. We can see what category and what their setting was based on that agreement and that requirement, so that we can get really good detail and control over who consented. And that allows us to determine when that banner is displayed and when it's not displayed. So now that we've gone through the application and seen a nice technical overview of the solution, let's go ahead and start our next segment, which is to solve for X, where we're going to take a look at those 3 technical challenges and how they were overcome. And the first of those is solving for UI and talking about how we face some unique challenges when it came to building the Lightning Web Component in multiple form factors so that we can make it mobile responsive and have those different view types within the component. We're then going to talk about solving for data, where we're really going to focus on talking about guest user access and understanding how to give guests access to that cookie data. Then lastly, we're going to talk about solving for composition and some of the unique challenges we had around communicating with cookies in the browser and getting those into our Lightning Web Component. And we're going to start that off by talking about solving for the UI. And I want to talk about how we've been able to create this interactive user interface where we sort of bring in that record data and then drive that UI based on the record data that exists. So for example, bringing these functional cookies as a category into our app and into our component, and then being able to group and display those there. Now, a lot of the challenges that came when building this application were actually getting that data into the component and then rendering it a way that made sense in a way that we see normally when cookies are created or when we're accepting a cookie banner on a website. So now, popping into the code here, you'll see we have our cookie consent.html file, and this is where the front end is really working hard on building this component. And you'll see here we have a lot of conditional sections that are used to display this data to our users. For example, we're managing loading here just to make sure that we're in the right state. We have our different page states here so that we can identify whether or not we're showing in the correct context. And so I'm going to go ahead and collapse this here so that you can see those different states that the component exists in. And what's really happening here is we have a couple of different states and full renderings based on what's been set in that field for managing that modal state within our JavaScript file. And if we open that up here, what you'll see here is we have a couple of methods here that return that state. And so we can say here, get footer state, and just return true if the display type is footer. If it's a modal state, we can return that. If it's page, we return true there. Just in the same way that in our last episode, those chatbots were conditionally rendering messages based on that user interaction, we're doing that same thing here within the component based on what's been defined in that component settings. And so based on that, you can see here, each state will have its own rendering. So if it's the footer state here, for example, we can see we have a specific style that's being applied based on the container class that's coming in for that footer. We are applying the padding from our JavaScript, so we're going and getting that class based on those settings here. And then we're bringing in the heading values, the style, etc. And everything's really being driven and computed within our JavaScript. And so you can see here in our user interface, we have lots of different things coming. So we have our heading style that's being returned, we have our text style that's being returned, and our link style that's being returned constantly. And the way that that works is within our component itself, we can specify either that class or style as being a property, and that property will then go and compute on the JavaScript side of things if we have a get in front of it. So for example, we have get link style, and that get link style is returning that standard font size that we want to return based on this, and then going and getting that footer link color that's set as a property within our component, and then applying that to that link style and then returning it into the component. And it's a really cool way of applying dynamic style to this component. Now, the next part of the component that was challenging, if we go into the component itself, in this view, was showing and hiding the columns based on those default settings, and then modifying them as we go along. And the way we're doing that is we're actually taking the array and modifying it on the fly when that button is clicked. So each array or each object within the array, so for example, in the section advertising cookies, there is a true or false set based on whether or not that column is being shown. And so if the show column attribute of that array or that object is set to true, it will show the details, and if not, it will hide them. And so what we're doing then is going through, and in our JavaScript here, in the show section method, we're going and taking a copy of the array. We're then finding that section name that was clicked, and then we're expanding it based on that, and we're changing that icon here so that the icon changes, and then we're setting that value based on the change so that we know to hide or show that content. And it was a really easy way of modifying that UI without doing too much work, without having to abstract into child components, and really just on the fly modifying that array so that we can expand that UI based on those changes. Please go ahead, check out the code there. It was quite interesting to figure out. We've created a great solution for hiding and showing those sections based on the data structure itself. That was sort of really cool when we figured out and started using it then in multiple places around some of the apps that we were building. Now, the next UI challenge that we solved for is, as I said, these multiple states, understanding how we can display those multiple states and form factors and have the component respond differently. Now, the challenge is pretty similar to what I was just talking about, in that we have those responsive sections within the components so that we can hide or show the sections based on that state. Now, all of those are controlled through the community builder, and so we have our public JavaScript properties here that we've tagged with our API decorator. So for example, we can bring in that type, we can bring in the heading itself, the instructions, the information button labels, and really expose those to the community and give the user really fine control within that experience builder towards displaying that component the way that they want on the page. And we do that by exposing the component and its properties in that sort of the JS meta file of our component so that we can modify that metadata definition and expose these properties. You can see here that we've exposed the component for the Lightning community, and then we've added in all of our properties here. We've then supplied the name, the type, the default value, and that data source there so that we can then maybe potentially define specific ways that the component is rendered. I think it's a great way of really exposing those properties and giving your users the ability to customize the components so that they're not having to always go into the code to modify those. And that was one of the big wins about the component. Now, when it comes to those multiple form factors, one of the things we really had to keep in mind was mobile responsiveness. So for example, if we go to our component here and we go ahead and we shrink the screen down, what you'll see here is that the buttons are changing. You can see the button widths and placement change based on that screen size. And the best way to do this within a community is by using media queries. And media queries in our CSS allow us to specify a specific page size. And so, for example, we have our media set to screen of a max width here is 480, and it overrides the CSS selectors and classes based on that screen width. And you can see here that we change the display types here based on that content so that we can show that content as responsive when we get down to a certain form factor or screen size. Now, if we look within that component here, we have our modal state component here. Let's go all the way down to the buttons in this component. And so here in our footer, you can see here we have a special desktop section that we've created for storing and displaying those buttons if we're in that desktop view. And then just below that, we have our mobile section here so that we can then view those components within a different form factor based on mobile. And what we're doing in our CSS is just hiding one of those columns when we get to a certain size and then showing the other one at that size and vice versa, so that we're showing that section conditionally based off the screen size. And it's a great way to create sort of really mobile responsive components. And it's a pattern that you see throughout the web when it comes to web development. Now, onto our next challenge, and that is data. Now, I'm sure a lot of us has hit up against some challenges when it comes to what information guest users can access and how they can modify data on Salesforce. And that's really been locked down over the last couple of releases and will continue to be changed and locked down further as time goes on. And I want to point you in the direction of a great article that was written by the Experienced Cloud and ISV Technical Evangelist team, where they talk about how you can get around some of these guest user challenges in a way that's secure and will pass security review from a Salesforce perspective. And one of the patterns that really stuck with me, you can find them by checking out this link, and we'll share it in the description of the video as well, is that it's best advised to go out to a helper class when wanting to access data that the guest can't access by default. Now, anyone who's installed this application has had many emails from me around guest user permissions will understand that guest user permissions have been a challenge when it's come to this application because of the amount of data that we need to give access to. We need to give access to the cookies themselves, the cookies sections. We need to be able to query against the individual records to find a match for that cookie itself and that unique identifier. And then we need to go and then get those settings that have already been agreed to when that community renders. And it's a lot of data access, and there's a lot of read-write happening against data that the guest user may not have access to. And so we've employed this pattern of having our cookie consent class that's exposed to the user that uses with sharing context, and then we have a guest helper that is going and running all of our DML and our SOCL that runs in without sharing context so that we can then provide access to that data for the users. And like I said, this is documented very well in this blog by the product team, so please refer to this first before trying to do something like this at home. But please use this as an example for a pattern which can be used to give that guest user access to data. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at that code here, in VS Code, let's go ahead and go into our classes. And the first one we have is our cookie consent service. And this is the class that's accessed by our Lightning Web Component itself. And you can see here we're doing a couple of things, like going and verifying the user's browser ID, which is that unique cookie that gives us access to the cookies themselves from the community. And we're going ahead, and you can see here, in a lot of cases, we're going out to this cookie consent service guest helper. So for example, the first thing we want to do is find out if we actually have an individual object that matches this cookie. So we're going to go ahead and employ our helper to go out and get us that information. If not, we're going to go ahead and set a new individual and set that ID. We can then go ahead and define which user type there is and whether or not the user's been logged in or not, and go and grab their cookies. And you just see here this repeated pattern of always going out to that cookie consent guest helper to verify this information. Now, some of the things that are happening within that helper are, you can see here initially, we're going and just querying for an individual. Now, Currently, you can't give access to a guest user to the individual object, so that's why we're having to pop out into without sharing context to go ahead and find a match for that browser ID. Now, it's very important to note that when you're building applications in this way, you're not leaking any information, so always do valid checks to make sure that the user is only getting back the data that they should be getting back. In this instance, we're getting back an ID based on whether or not this individual was found and matched to the user's browser ID. In the same instance here, you can see how we're employing that same pattern to go ahead and create the records and create those authorization form consent records. Because the user does not generally have access to creating those records, we can pop out to our helper to create those records. Now, we're not dealing with anything sensitive here at the moment. We're just taking that browser stamp and creating those consent records against that so that we can query them back when that user is pulling the data. And this is just an example of how we've employed this pattern to give the guest user access to that data without needing permission sets to gain access to the objects, because in this case, we cannot give the guest user direct access to that information. We can only control in small chunks when that information is distributed through that guest helper that we've created. Now, our last technical challenge, and was my favorite, and I needed a lot of help to come up with the answer, so huge shout out to some of the experienced cloud team for helping me do this, was getting access to the cookies from within our component. Now, just popping out to our component quickly, if we go into our application tab and go in and view cookies here, you can see here we have a number of cookies available that have been dropped onto the user who's browsing the website. Now, these cookies are dropped by default in communities and cannot be modified. No matter how many components you have, once these cookies are dropped, you cannot modify them, and they are dropped before the component renders because they are part of that Lightning community runtime. And so there's nothing that we can do about them. Please check out the documentation. They're documented very well, but you must note that these cookies exist in the browser. Now, what we needed to do was find a unique identifier for that browser. And we did that in the browser ID. And this browser ID cookie is just a random string that's used to assign to a person as that browser's unique identity. You'll see we also have a secure browser ID here as well that has the same value, but acts as a fallback for those cookies. And so when initially building out this component, the thought was, okay, in order to find out whether or not someone has consented to cookies, we need to go and we need to get that browser ID and we need to validate it against the database to see if this person has already consented to cookies. If they have consented to cookies, great, let them pass, let everything run. If they've not consented to some of the cookies, run through and delete them from that browser. Now, the challenge is gaining access to these cookies. Now, when we query the cookies object within our Lightning Web Component, we're running in the context of Locker Service, and we do not have access to those values. Now, initially, the thought was, okay, great, within communities, we can turn Locker Service off. And you can turn Locker off, and you can query the DOM for those cookies, and we can go and get that array of cookies. And the component generally can run in that context. And you can see here, if we go into our Lightning Web Component for cookie consent, and so let's go into our LWCs here, and into cookie consent in our cookie-consent.js, we can initially check here whether or not we can have access to that browser ID cookie, and we're going and grabbing that. So here we can see in our connected callback, the first thing we're doing is checking if the component is in preview, so that we can track that display mode. Then we can say, okay, if we're running in our relaxed CSP mode, which is our locker off mode, let's go ahead and get the browser ID cookie. And if not, we're going to go ahead and add an event listener to the page to try and get them, but more on that in a second. But generally, we have our get browser ID cookie here, where we're just going and getting our cookie name and our cookie value, and we're just going document.cookie.match and grabbing our cookies. And it's as easy as just that one line of code that goes and gets us our cookie based on the name. Now, unfortunately, a lot of organizations and companies should be running with Locker turned on. And that's where we came up with a challenge of actually going in and finding a way to get those cookies. And if we go back to our diagram here, the solution for that is to reach out to the community's head and run a little bit of JavaScript that allows us to get the cookies. Now, this pattern was employed in our last Behind the App episode, where we talked about sending messages as a user through the chatbots. We're doing the same thing here, where we're sending a message up to the DOM in the head of our community that says, okay, listen out to see if we're ready for cookies. Once this component is loaded, we send that message up. This script in the head of the component queries the DOM for the cookies and then posts back a message to the component with a payload that contains the cookies. Now, you can see here, if we go into our experience builder here, if we go ahead and modify this community and go into developer and then into advanced, we can edit the head markup, and you'll see here we're calling out to a script inside of our static resource. And this runs in the head of the community and allows us to do something outside of our Lightning Web component that will then maybe modify some of the page or get us information like the cookies. And so if we go into our script here, that script called cookieconsent.js here, it just does a couple of things. Number one is it adds an event listener to the window that lets us say, okay, if we hear the event, we can go ahead and run this one and dispatch this one. Then we have one for deleting the cookies. And so once this event is received, this component connected event, we just say let cookies equal document.cookies. Then we create a custom event and we dispatch the event, just like you would do in a Lightning Web component. Our component can then subscribe to this event and capture that payload of the cookies. And so if we go ahead and look back at our cookieconsent.js here, you can see here we can then receive cookies from head. We can then get those cookies and then run it here. Now, you see we have the get cookies from head event here as well that we mentioned that runs and creates that component connected event and pushes it up to that head. And it's a really cool way of working around some of the issues and challenges when it comes to accessing something like the cookies, which we need to in this component, and allows us to access those within that community. Now, it's important, I just have to point out and note that if Locker is turned off, then in the component itself, you can go ahead and set the used relax CSP setting based on Locker being turned off. And what that looks like is if we go into our security settings here, we can then go ahead and turn CSP down to relaxed and then turn Locker service off. And that will allow the component to run by just querying the DOM for the cookies. If this is not the case, then you must use that script method and apply the script in the head, and that will then allow you to capture the cookies there. It was a really interesting challenge to solve, and thankfully, once again, to that Experience Cloud team, there's another blog about this as well, created a pattern for us to be able to access that information straight from our component and communicate with the head of the community to actually grab those cookies and add them within the browser. And it was a really interesting challenge around whether or not we should use Locker or not. And we were then able to find a way that allows you to communicate with the head and grab those cookies without having to turn off Locker, which I think is a huge result when it comes to the component and making it usable for everyone. So first off, go install Community Cookie Consent. It is available on the App Exchange for you to download, as well as the source code is available on GitHub. So if you have any ideas, please submit some ideas, submit issues, create a pull request, and we'll get that modified into the app. And let's really help at making this component a standard for accessing cookies on communities. Now, thank you very much for attending today's session. We will be running another episode of Behind the App next month, 1 week earlier due to the holiday break for Thanksgiving in the United States. And I'm really excited to be sharing with you what solution we're going to be talking about that month. Please go back and look at the back catalog. We have 3 previous episodes of Behind the App where we look at some really cool apps. Like I said, the multi-org security summary, we have the Lightning File Explorer, and then the LWC chat pack. All really different, really cool apps, a lot of which center around Lightning Web Component development that will really help inspire you when it comes to building out cool apps on Salesforce. Now, like I said, check out the code, download the app, and please support Salesforce Labs. It's such a great program, and give us our feedback on our apps. I really hope that you were able to learn a bit more about the Cookie Consent app and some of the technicalities and around that solution and the way that it was built. And please go and check that out and provide some feedback. Thank you very much for attending this episode of Behind the App. Have a good one. Bye.